Thanks, Shani. Welcome, everyone. Today, again, we're focused a lot on fire, fuels management, invasives, and whatnot, highlighting a lot of our collaborative projects funded by the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, or at least that's on today's slate. But again, kind of a theme throughout all these sessions has been a lot of integration of science, and a lot of the talks today really are great examples of kind of iterative projects that are fairly long-term and have been able to build some foundational building blocks, add additional objectives in subsequent years to answer more questions that are management relevant. So starting us off today, we've got Matt Germino from the USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center up out of Boise, Idaho. And Matt's going to be giving two talks today. The first is about the longevity of herbicides targeting invasive annual grasses and their interplay with sage-steppe soils. So Matt, I can see your face. I can see your slides.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lea. So this project focused on how long do herbicides last and how does that relate to the slow recovery of perennials that are important for providing competitive resistance against reinvasion by exotic annual grasses, has been supported by LEAF and the Ecosystems Mission Area program and the BLM Rangeland program. This work was motivated and supported by much pilot funding and in-kind investments by land managers in a variety of different organizations, federal, private, state, and more. And so Bryn is sitting here with me, and she's a principal person in this large effort. Let's see if I can get the slides to advance. Okay, so obviously herbicides are a key tool, one of the only things that we have available to help us reduce exotic annual grasses, which is critical for defending the core, defending core habitat that we want to protect. These areas in sagebrush and other shrub steppe are semi-arid, and so the plants in general, especially the perennials, are slow growing. But aside from that, many of the perennials of interest are just inherently slow growing. So the durability of the herbicide effectiveness is really important. The general strategy here is to apply herbicides that have pre-emergent qualities and effects to soil. And we can expect that when they are active, seeds of any species will be inhibited from developing into seedlings. And that will be a selective disadvantage to annuals and will thereby benefit perennials. But the pre-emergent herbicides tend to vary in just how pre-emergent they are and how long they last. So in addition to imazapic, which is the workhorse for most land management agencies, and by workhorse I mean it's been applied over many hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of acres. It does have some post-emergent effects. If you spray it in the fall or the spring onto areas where sandbird bluegrass or crested wheatgrass have greened up, you can usually see a little bit of yellowing. It may not kill them, but it does have a post-emergent effect. And it does have a much stronger pre-emergent effect. It's thought to only last a couple of years. That's the conventional wisdom. But I'll show some data today that Bryn and I collected, which shows its effects can actually be a lot more enduring in certain situations. Indaziflam, which goes by the trade name Ruderal, has just recently been added to the BLM's toolbox, and other agencies have been applying it for an even longer period of time. It's still a newcomer. And people are excited about it because, number one, it acts as a true pre-emergent, meaning that it won't damage green leaves if you spray it onto them generally. And it's thought to have a longer period of effectiveness. The conventional wisdom is up to 5 years. And we'll show some data that supports that we'll also show some other studies where we didn't get as long of or as strong as an effect as we expected. So the key thing here is that the indaziflam is more expensive than imazapic. And when you think about the longevity of control, there's oftentimes you see imazapic sprayed repeatedly. In those cases, we begin to worry about induction of genetic herbicide resistance in the targeted weed populations. So that is the greatest fear and loathing of any weed manager. So also repeated sprayings, every time you put a helicopter or a spray boom in place, you're incurring costs. We need more studies on both the target and the non-target effects. Keep in mind those non-target effects may feed back to influence like reinvasion. And we need information across all the different site types that we have in the sagebrush steppe. And so working with LEAF and others in the agencies, we started and have curated these 4 meta-studies that I'll talk about today, in which we applied imazapic with methylated seed oil, indaziflam, or rimsulfuron, using broadcast spray applications from helicopters, trucks, ATVs, or actually by hand also. These treatments go way back in time. The Idaho Governor's Office for Species Conservation worked with BLM and other state agencies to motivate the Idaho State Sage Grouse Action experiment, where for many, like nearly 100 25 by 25 foot plots on either state, federal, or private lands, we have longest running experiment on imazapic and rimsulfuron. Idaho Transportation Department is keenly concerned with exotic annual grasses and these tools. And so they engaged us in a set of experiments that were at even larger plots. Even larger yet were acre-sized plots that occurred on the backside of the iconic Table Mountain near Boise, working with state and private landowners. And then our largest plots occurred on a nearby national wildlife refuge. So we've got experiments on areas that you would consider core sagebrush steppe, fully intact, areas that have been recently burned, areas where the change has been somewhat accepted, if you will. And we've got domination by exotic annual grasses. We want to know, can these tools be used to help rebuild buffer zones or grow the core, if you will. So areas that generally are considered to have low resistance. And then also there's areas where the change has been directed towards tolerable introduced perennial grasslands. Can we continue to reduce exotic annual grass threats to these and maybe perhaps grow them into better core? The invaders for us are the trifecta of cheatgrass, medusa, and ventinata. Our first product from this study is already published, and I'm not going to show any graphs from it. I'll just simply tell you that Bryn's careful work across these 3 different ecoregions, and again, about 100 smallish plots, revealed that careful applications of imazapic can have enduring effects of up to 5 years. That's much longer than the nominal 1 to 2 years of control that conventional wisdom generally holds. We're now studying the reinvasion process that is well underway and have discovered some demographic mechanisms that underlie the loss of longevity, and that in those cases after a nice 5-year period. So I will show some graphs from our Idaho Transportation Department collaboration from very low condition sites over here near the core of Boise, and then going up into the uplands of the more pristine Owyhee Mountains, where we have core habitat. Here you can see a photo of an unburned area that had some sagebrush and perennials, and compare the effects of indaziflam or druva to an area that has been burned and still was in reasonably good condition. Here you can see that in both cases, whatever effects of Rejuva we saw were delayed. That's pretty common. But you can see here, we were able to keep the annual grasses below the nominal threshold of 0.2 fractional cover. That would be equivalent to 20% cover of cheatgrass or any other annual. That's a desirable threshold. Generally, we see that when annual grasses are below that threshold, they tend to not readily increase over time. And therefore, you're less likely to have a progression towards exotic annual grasslands. And by the way, I'll talk a little bit about the thresholds for perennial grasses. Generally, we desire perennial grasses to be above 20%. Anyways, you can see here that this area is surrounded by the 2015 Soda wildfire, where there's quite a bit more invasion. We got about almost 5 years of control with Rejuva, started to get reinvaded a little bit, but we did keep, Rejuva kept the invasion, protected the core, defended the core. We cannot explain why in the burned area we saw a much less of an effect of Rejuva. It didn't get us below the 20% threshold. Bryn took some nice photos of the dye. We put dye in the herbicide, and it looked like the spray pattern might have been a little bit too spotty, the droplet pattern. And I'll talk in a moment about another study that gives us insight on how escapes, untreated plants might relate to the loss of treatment effectiveness and the loss of durability. Moving to lower elevations here, closer to Boise, here you can see Imazapic, really not too effective in a more degraded site. Indaziflam, even by itself, gave us pretty nice control, getting below that 20% annual grass threshold, at least for about a year and a half, and causing a marked reduction in the exotic annual grasses out to 5 years. Unfortunately, the seedings that came here didn't work too well, nor did the seedings work on this neighboring site near Top Hat, where we've got much larger acre size plots. Here, the cocktail of Imazapic and indaziflam gave about 5 years of nice control and about 3.5 years below that threshold. Imazapic, again, pretty weak compared to Rejuva. Rejuva effects by themselves, they've less effective than the cocktail at this particular site. And those effects vary by the year of application. Moving on to our biggest plots, helicopter sprayed, hundreds of acres, either Rejuva by itself or the cocktail. This study shows, I won't show you the graph, but it showed that the effects lasted about 3 years. By that third year, indaziflam had caught up to the cocktail. The lack of effectiveness appears to be due to the implementation. Maybe the droplets were too large and varied. The escaped, those first few plants that came back in produced a huge amount of seed and probably led to the reinvasion. What can you do after Imazapic or after indaziflam? You can't seed, but you can plant. We gave a greenhouse to Ty Matthews here and his colleagues, and they've been outplanting hundreds of plots. So the info is being used to plan, design, implement, monitor, evaluate the treatments. Variability is a really critical thing to consider here. It can result from year-to-year weather, water. Rejuva is very sensitive to precipitation. Site spatial variability, huge factor. So we're seeing variability in indaziflam effects, but generally it is more effective and it does last longer. It is more expensive. Although we showed it was effective in degraded sites, we would advocate that if you're considering using it, because you can't seed afterwards, you probably need to be very sure that you've got enough residual perennials to respond positively and effectively give you a spray and release. Much more that I could talk about, like exotic forbs and biocrusts. If you're interested, please reach out to me or Brent. Thank you.
All right. Our next presenters are Dr. Doug Shinneman, also from the Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center up in Boise, as well as Austin Nash from our Western Ecological Research Center down in Dixon, California. Doug and Austin are going to tee off two back-to-back talks here. So the first one, we're going to talk about this iterative framework for delivering fuel break science in the Great Basin. And then without pausing, we're going to talk about the use of drones to survey fuel breaks in sagebrush. So Doug, I can see your slides.
Great. Okay, we'll get started. Thanks.
Your face, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So yeah, thanks. So I'm going to, as Lea mentioned, I'm going to combine two related fuel break projects into one presentation. The first is the collaborative fuel break science project titled here, for which I'd like to acknowledge the lead folks involved, Pete Coates, Kelly Weiss, Austin Nash, Brianna Brussi, Stephen Matthew Sanchez, and Michelle Christ. Austin will hop on in a bit to present a few slides a little later in the presentation. I'd also like to acknowledge many other individuals who've contributed to this project in different ways and also help from key BLM partners. And I'd like to acknowledge our funders, the Bureau of Land Management, the Joint Fire Science Program, and USGS. So field breaks in sagebrush dominated landscapes are a valuable management tool to combat the threat of the invasive grass fire cycle, which leads to conversion of native shrublands into fire-prone annual grasslands that degrade rangeland resources, threaten human development and safety, and provides inadequate habitat for numerous sagebrush-dependent species. Fuel breaks can help to decrease the spread of wildfire by reducing or modifying fuel loads, affecting fire behavior, and creating safer environments for fire suppression activities. They can also compartmentalize the landscape into more manageable units for fire suppression, ideally containing fires before they become too large to control. In the Great Basin, there's generally three types of fuel breaks commonly used: mowed fuel breaks, green strips, which are typically planted with non-native perennial species that hold moisture later in the fire season, and then brown strips, which are maintained to be devoid of vegetation. In the Great Basin, up to 11,000 miles of new or improved fuel breaks are either being implemented or planned by the BLM for the next several years. In addition to intended benefits of fuel breaks, there may also be unintended effects. Obviously, changes are going to occur in the fuel break itself, including removing or reducing native shrub cover. But there's also the potential for fuel breaks to contribute to the spread of fire-prone invasive annuals, for instance. In addition, although fuel breaks may serve to protect wildlife habitat from wildfire, which is definitely one of their key advantages, they could also unintentionally fragment habitat or alter wildlife behavior, such as facilitating predator movement. So the overarching objectives of this research are to develop sampling and evaluation protocols that enhance understanding of fuel break effectiveness and their ecological effects, compatible with agency monitoring and adaptive management objectives. The research has two main phases. Phase one focuses on developing sampling techniques for obtaining information on a wide variety of attributes, so certainly fuels, but also invasives, wildlife usage, and other factors in and around already established fuel breaks. And then phase two will capture similar data, but it involves locating and sampling a network of fuel break monitoring sites both before and after fuel break implementation, allowing us to more confidently ascertain the effects of fuel breaks over time. So later in this talk, just a quick plug again, I'll also discuss a related project to determine the utility of using uncrewed aerial systems to efficiently classify vegetation and fuel conditions in and around fuel breaks. So for phase one, we sampled fuel breaks scattered throughout portions of central and northern Nevada, primarily located in low to medium resistance and resilience settings. And we also concentrated sampling in the Big Desert Fuel Break Project area in south central Idaho. This past year, we began sampling for our phase two of the research in the Tri-State Fuel Break Project area, which is spread across mostly southeast Oregon and southwest Idaho. Forward ahead, so you can see that. And then we also sampled fuel breaks using UAS in 2024, as I mentioned earlier. And we'll present a few preliminary results from the initial research and then highlight progress for phase two and for the UAS-based project. So in the Big Desert Project area, we developed a plot design focused on more proximal effects of fuel break treatments that included sampling both inside but also just outside of mowed fuel breaks. We sampled over 3 different years to capture the influence of climate variability, and plots were spatially stratified to reflect fire history in the area. Our plot design was meant to efficiently capture conditions both within but also outside of field breaks, as well as to capture a gradient of change along a transect or a series of transects from the road edge extending up to and then beyond the field break and into the surrounding untreated landscape. We have a manuscript in progress in which we're analyzing those conditions under these different settings. I won't have time to focus on those results today, but rather I'd like to turn it over to Austin to discuss work he's been leading on field break effects in the Great Basin, using data collected in the field, mostly in Nevada, but also coupled with analysis of additional data sets. So Austin, I'll turn it over to you and just let me know when to forward the slides.
Sounds good. Thanks, Doug. Yeah, today I'm going to be talking about an expansion of some of our work that occurred in Nevada, where we were targeting surveys near existing field breaks, and you'll see that in this left figure with the blue dots. So we wanted to expand the scope of inference on this study. So we brought in AIM data, and we also brought in some RAP remotely sensed vegetation products I'll talk about in a second to try to investigate how field breaks might be associated with annual grass. So there's a lot of other work in this project that's not just focused on annual grass, but today I'll be just talking about those results. So on the right side here, you'll see that we have targeted surveys from within a field break out to 1 kilometer away from a field break. These occurred after a field break was installed. And we also opportunistically grabbed AIM surveys that occurred after that field break was installed. We measured the amount of annual grass at these sites. We took the distance from the site, from the individual survey site to the field break, and the age since field break installation. And then we used a generalized linear mix model with an interaction of distance times time. So how far away it is from the field break and how long it's been since the field break was treated to estimate spatiotemporal patterns in annual grass after field break installation. And we looked at this for green strips and for mowed field breaks. Next slide. So first thing I'll highlight is we have a different axis value here for the green and the mowed field breaks. But what we see in green field breaks is we see a very slow decline in annual grass cover over time. We don't see evidence for a spread of annual grass from the installation of green field breaks. Now for mowed field breaks, we do see a pattern of increasing annual grass closer to field breaks over time that spreads out over 16 years. However, this could be confounded by the fact that field breaks are often installed near roads, and we know that roads have effects on annual grass species covered. So we wanted to disentangle this by conducting a Bakke style analysis where we took RAP remotely sensed data before and after field breaks were installed at field break locations 500 meters from a field break and 1,000 meters from a field break. And we compared those to control sites that were at the same distance from a road, but did not have a field break installed. We can go to the next slide. And now with our Bakke results, we see similar patterns where on the right side with mowed field breaks, we see increases in annual grass over time. And this is relative to control sites, which lends a little bit more support that this annual grass increase is potentially due to a field break and not just the road itself. On the green side, we do see some declines at 500 meters and 1 kilometer from a field break. And we see about a stable increase for about 15 years at a green strip field break that increases over time, although with our sensitivity analyses, that final uptick doesn't seem to be supported. So it seems to be that there's a strong agreement between these two analyses that green strips are a little bit more resistant to annual grass invasion than mowed strips.
Thanks, Austin. So starting in 2024, we began locating a network of additional monitoring sites, again, using a before-after control impact style study design. The Bakke design is considered one of the most scientifically robust to understand ecological changes due to land treatments. And the approach allows us to measure conditions both within future field break sites and in nearby sites that will remain untreated over time, or the controls, both before and after field breaks are implemented, and allowing us to detect changes over time in vegetation, fuels, or wildlife usage that can then more confidently be attributed to treatment effects. And ideally, this will permit a fairly comprehensive assessment of field break effects relative to specific agency management objectives. We got a good start in 2024, sampling 21 paired plots for vegetation and fuels located within planned field break locations and in nearby control locations, as I mentioned earlier, and across a range of environmental settings within big sagebrush community types. We hope to establish and sample more pretreatment sites this year, that is before planned field break construction, as well as to resample a handful of sites that were treated late last year, so we'll have our first year of post-treatment effects. We're also interested in whether wildlife will select or avoid these treated vegetation conditions. To estimate these patterns, we're conducting another Backy-style study for wildlife in tandem with the vegetation study. We've placed cameras along roads, in future treated areas and outside of treated areas for each of our treatment sites, and then created matched control sites so that we can investigate if reduced occupancy or changes in occupancy within a site is due to alterations in vegetation conditions from fuel treatments, or more generally reflects population trends in the region. At each of our sites, we're collecting wildlife habitat selection data using camera traps, fecal surveys, and visual surveys for raptors, ravens, horses, and livestock. This is an ongoing study, but so far we've seen mule deer, elk, sagebrush, coyote, and many other species out on the landscape. So that's kind of cool. Okay, going to quickly switch gears now to a related project in which we're using uncrewed aerial systems to survey field break conditions in sagebrush-steppe. And again, I'd like to acknowledge many co-PIs and collaborators on this project, and our funders, the BLM and the USGS. But want to acknowledge Jason Quitler, Taylor Dudenacki, Pete Coates, Kelly Weiss, Ben Gustafson, and Jason Regosio. Specific project objectives include determining the utility and efficiency of UAS-mounted sensor technology to first classify different rangeland fuel types, so litter, grasses, shrubs, but also fuel structures, including fine fuel continuity, but also shrub height or other vegetation height types, using multispectral RGB and structure from motion data or 3D data. We will then work to scale up the UAS data using high resolution satellite imagery for broader scale classifications. To accomplish all that, we've flown our UAS in 3 relatively large areas in and around field breaks in South Central Idaho during June, and then again in July of 2024. The timing of the 2 flight periods was meant to capture phenological changes, particularly to detect and quantify senescing exotic annual grasses as fine fuels. We also collected veg data in the field at each site to train and validate our models. So a key part of this project was to determine how efficient using UAS might be to capture this information along these sort of extensive linear features that field breaks form on the landscape. We flew a Wingtra 1 Gen 2 UAS, and for example, here we were able to capture high-res data over roughly 150 acres in about 25 minutes. We developed a flight plan that was compatible with capturing conditions both inside, but also immediately adjacent or a little bit outside of the field breaks, which are located along roads. And I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but here's some examples of obtained imagery and results of initial processing, including RGB aerials, 3D canopy models of sagebrush heights, and segmented delineation of sagebrush crowns. And as I mentioned earlier, we're also capturing phenological changes to identify invasive annual grasses, detectable by comparisons of early green up and then early senescence. Here in the figure at right, you can see the difference in NDVI values, and especially those shown as purple and red, indicating the largest change from peak green to senescence, thus indicating relative cheatgrass dominance in that particular landscape. Really quickly, just to wrap things up, we're hoping to use multispectral time series data and our 3-dimensional structural data to characterize the current vegetation conditions within field breaks, both at very fine scales, but also scaled up, coupled with other remotely sensed imagery. We'll use that to explore ways to translate or classify this data into standard fuel models for estimates of potential fire behavior, and share that information with land managers so that we can better understand both the capabilities and the limitations of using UAS to monitor vegetation and field conditions. In closing, our intent is to continue to sample field breaks for phase 2, submit journal publications and other deliverables from phase 1, and continue to analyze our UAS obtained data and deliver a final publication for that work as well. Here's a list of products that have already been published or in prep from this work, but also please visit the USGS Field Break Science webpage shown to the right, where we have more information and access to additional field break related publications and data sets that we've produced over the last few years. And that's it for me. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to queue up our next speaker. So we've got Beth Orning from our Fort Collins Science Center. And today, Beth is going to talk to us about an economic assessment of treating invasive annual grasses and different scenarios and what those things might cost. So, Beth, I can see your slides.
And can you hear me now?
I can hear your voice.
Okay. I don't think I got my camera back on, but I will perhaps just carry on without it. I'll get it on later. But good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here to talk about our work developing this simulation model to help inform AAG management efforts across the sagebrush biome. I want to start by acknowledging my co-authors for this work from Fort, Brian, Cam, Catherine, and James Meldrum. So I also want to acknowledge that we've had many stakeholders across federal, state, university, and industry engaging with us on this model development, and that the work was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, and USGS. Folks here are likely familiar with the sagebrush conservation design, or what I'll refer to as the SCD for the rest of this talk. As a spatially prioritized design strategy, the SCD separates the landscape into core sagebrush, growth opportunity, and other rangeland areas based on the results of an evaluation of ecological integrity under multiple threats. These classifications were developed to guide sagebrush conservation and help managers identify areas best suited to defend the core and grow the core focal management. From a manager's perspective, an important consideration for a large-scale spatial prioritization strategy like this centers on what implementation will cost. If we consider the landscape as an intersection of SCD sagebrush categories and different bins of invasive annual grass cover, we can use the potential threats that those levels of infestation pose to construct a spatial matrix of where to prioritize management. The biome faces multiple threats, of course, but for this project, we were focused on projecting the costs and expected benefits of AAG management under the SCD. The simple way of putting a price tag on this would be to take how many acres there are under each SCD category, the treatment cost per acre, and just calculate it all out. But that would just be for 1 year. And folks here know that this isn't a static situation. Plant invasion is a dynamic process. In any given year, we might have invasion spreading into new areas that there wasn't previously any AIG occurrence, and another area might have low-level invasions growing into higher levels of cover. At the same time, people are treating infestations and reducing cover, which all makes for a lot of moving parts to try and relate costs and benefits of AIG management actions. With an interactive and dynamic process like this, a state transition model framework is a useful approach to solving this kind of problem because these models can simulate and track the ongoing spread of invasion, how AAG is going to be impacted by treatments, and the costs associated with each of those treatments. So we developed an AIG state transition simulation model framework to explore what the costs and benefits of SCD strategies could be for the sagebrush biome. Our objectives for this work were to generate a cost matrix breaking down treatment costs as a function of different invasion levels and site conditions, and then to provide a comparison of multi-year monetary costs for different AIG management scenarios. And finally, to deliver a spatial layer of AIG treatment costs for the biome. We work with a panel of managers and experts to co-develop a spatially explicit STSM of AIG dynamics in sagebrush landscapes. During the meetings for this process, we had discussions to identify management actions and objectives, tune model parameters, and decide on a set of scenarios that would be useful to inform AIG management. This was an iterative process that was conducted over 13 meetings from 2022 to 2023. The diagram here is the conceptual model resulting from that process. Oops, apologies about that. Jumping way too far ahead. Apologies. So this diagram is the conceptual model, and the boxes represent discrete states. The lines and arrows represent the different processes that move one state to another, with solid lines representing the successful actions and dashed lines representing unsuccessful ones. The AIG cover class for each cell on the landscape changes over time based on a set of deterministic and probabilistic transition rules, which included natural and management transitions. I'm not going to go into all the nuts and bolts for the model, but I do want to highlight a couple of things to help place results in later slides in context. With the panel's input, we translated SCD, defend, grow, and mitigate strategies into specific actions associated with different AIG cover classes. This is represented by that box matrix on the lower left. The group decided that EDR treatments would target low abundance infestations and represent a defend type of action, while native grass seeding would represent a grow action applied secondarily to aerial herbicide and targeted to moderate and high cover infestations in core and growth opportunity areas. And then finally, mitigate actions would be represented by aerial herbicide treatment targeted to moderate and high cover infestations. Putting this all together, the blue box on the right outlines the management scenarios that we developed for the landscape. We've broken these down into 3 simulation scenario sets. Each scenario was run for 20 years. The first simulation set represents the baseline dynamics, allowing us to compare outcomes from alternate non-SCD based scenarios. So basically what happens if we do nothing and there's no management, or what happens under a reactive scenario that isn't spatially prioritized, but instead has actions that focus on treatment of moderate to high cover infestations once they're established on the landscape. And then simulation sets 2 and 3 represent proactive SCD strategies, implementing spatially prioritized defend and grow, and defend, grow, and mitigate scenarios. The goal of simulation set 2 was to get an idea of what this might cost in total if we aim to treat all infestation levels within a given spatial strategy. So it's actually simulated with unconstrained budgets. The goal of simulation set 3 was to get an idea of what the costs and benefits associated with those same spatial strategies would be under constrained situations more realistic to budget limitations. To do this, we took the cumulative 20-year cost results from scenarios in simulation set 2 and applied them based on an even allocation of those costs over each year. So now we're going to move into some of our results. Obviously, there's a lot of ways to potentially quantify effectiveness in terms of controlling a plant invasion. Here we're looking at the AIG outcomes from simulation sets 1 and 2 for the biome. As a reminder, these are the these are the baseline and unconstrained budget scenario 20-year outcomes on the right, and then initial 2022 conditions are shown on the far left of the chart. We can see that at the biome level, baseline management scenarios of doing nothing or responding to high cover threats produce similar outcomes, with most of the biome progressing to moderate infestation levels by 2042. From rangeland wildfire research, we know the probability of wildfire increases 4-fold at greater than 10% AAG cover. So it's important to consider that this 8 to 15% cover outcome still poses a real risk. Proactive unconstrained SCD management resulted in 8 to 28% of the biome projected to benefit from reduced AIG, seen in the chart as uninvaded in the darkest blue color on the map figures. With that lower 8% amount being roughly equivalent to the amount of designated core sagebrush in the biome. We'll be looking at the cost and distribution of these 3 scenarios in more detail next. So what do you get for those reduced AIG benefits, and what do they cost? Here we've broken down costs for each SCD AIG cover class threat category for the unconstrained defend the core scenario. The map on the lower right shows the cumulative 20-year average cost per pixel from low in blue to high in red, and the corresponding average AIG cover outcomes are shown in the upper right map. So from the table here, you can see that the cumulative price tag for 20 years of defend the core was just over $4.6 billion. For the unconstrained defend and grow the core scenario, the price tag was a little over $19 billion. Which breaks down to about 4 times the cost for a 16% gain in the amount of uninvaded cover. For the unconstrained defend and grow the core plus mitigate scenario, the price tag was projected to be $29 billion. This breaks down to 1.5 times the cost to defend and grow the core for an additional 4% gain in the amount of uninvaded cover on the landscape. Here we're looking at the average uninvaded cover gained versus total cumulative costs for the biome. Essentially, this figure is showing what you've accomplished in terms of AIG reduction and what those gains cost relative to no management, which highlights that when you extend treatment beyond core sagebrush, you are facing diminishing returns. And that essentially the most cost-effective approach on a dollar per hectare basis would be to focus on a defend the core only strategy. However, an important caveat to consider with our biome-wide results centers on outcomes obtained from regional model simulations that were used to extrapolate these course scale extents, which I wasn't able to present today. But notably, these regional result outcomes varied pretty widely and demonstrated that the magnitude of diminishing returns is going to vary from region to region. So we're wrapping up writing for 2 manuscripts that will cover the regional sampling and simulation model framework and the SCD costs and effectiveness that I talked about today. And we're also working on a larger economic analysis using the cost results that will be detailed in a report later this year. So along with the manuscripts, we plan to release the model and output layers, which could be used to extract projected AIG and average costs for any selected area of the biome. This could help local managers in planning efforts, providing a resource to gauge expected benefits of implementing proactive strategies or justifications for funds sought to treat AIG. Layers could also be integrated with other decision support tools to gauge different kinds of benefits. Finally, we've only scratched the surface with the questions addressed by our scenarios, and there's potentially more to explore. For example, if eradication isn't the goal, identifying scenarios that maintain landscapes at current levels or below some threshold might cost less and achieve acceptable AIG outcomes. With additional funding, the model could also be expanded to consider other important drivers in terms of wildfire or drought effects. And with that, I want to thank you all for your attention, and the QR code on this code would take you to our project website, which I will also drop in the chat here in a moment. And I'm happy to take any questions if I have time for that or afterward.
All right, I'm going to queue up our next speaker, who is also our first speaker. So we've got Matt Germino again from the USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center. And Matt's second talk is going to be really focused on the effectiveness of layering treatments, and some other information about when we can get burn lands back into some multiple uses. So Matt, I can see your face. Hello, Bill. Good to go.
Thank you. Okay, so our project is focused on improving treatment effectiveness. So it feeds in nicely, but the central problem is oftentimes we need to increase the abundance of perennial herbs and especially bunch grasses in addition to reducing exotic annuals. Let's see if I can get my slides to advance. What's going on here? Okay. This project was supported by the Ecosystems Management Area, the SURF program, and also by the BLM Rangeland program. Thank you very much. There are many land managers, particularly in BLM, who both motivated and have facilitated this work and really have co-produced it. So thank you very much to all of them. I'll show examples of their contributions. So I'm wondering if many of you realize or appreciate that the most widespread, extensive restoration treatment after wildfire is actually the deferment of grazing, which usually happens for a nominal 2 years. This is a super important treatment in itself. We might not think of it that way, but it is, because you have to decide when to bring the cows back and in what way, like when, where, and how. And generally what we're worried about is, first of all, getting the cows back, because these are rangelands, but doing it in a way that does not compromise the recovery of the process of the perennial herbs. When are those perennial herbs, and especially bunch grasses, mature enough and ready to withstand grazing pressure and still be able to survive and provide competitive pressure against cheatgrass invasion? Key question. And this is important to consider in light of the active treatments that are much more expensive, and we want to make sure that the resumption of livestock grazing doesn't damage whatever benefits these treatments have generated. One of the tricks with combining these active treatments is that pre-emergent herbicides will inhibit the seed-based establishment of the targeted weeds, but then they'll also have negative effects on the non-target co-treated or co-seeded restoration species. And so our options are to come up with some ways of temporarily separating these treatments, or there's also some new innovative prospects for spatially separating seeds and herbicides. So, this talk is focused on what are the incremental gains in the myriad ways of separating treatments, herbicides for exotic annual grasses with seeding of desirable perennials. I won't talk much today on a lot of our work that we discovered that there's some pretty major statistical and inferential problems that must be addressed when evaluating treatment effects. This relates to the non-random way that managers selectively apply these treatments to the landscape. I talked about those in previous updates on this research. I'm going to skip that today. So, and then again, once we get the herbicides and drill seedings in place, how can we carefully then layer on the next treatment, which is livestock grazing? So today I'm going to talk about two different experimental setups, while they're actually a combination of experiments and real operational trials. The first happened after the Soda wildfire. This is a very well studied wildfire that consists of over 2,000 observation plots arrayed over about a 300,000 acre area. And then the second is actually an older study where it's a smaller fire, but one that was very intensively seeded. And we were able to get in with BLM to start some experiments. Both of these involve real grazing, so using large exclosures to exclude livestock. And then within the exclosures, we simulated grazing with clipping treatments. And the clipping treatments generally, Bill, how much did they remove? It was like a moderate grazing treatment?
For stout, we had moderate and heavy grazing. And then
With
for
the
soda, with the clipping. And then on the soda, it was all heavy utilization.
Okay. And those specifications were given to us by our BLM colleagues. Our measurements, transect, line point intercept for cover, also measuring plant density, the size of grasses, and basal gaps. So soda, in addition to being the most studied wildfire out there, is also one of the most heavily treated. And here you can see the different ways that imazapic was sprayed on. And those sprayings happened either before or after drill seedings of either native or introduced perennial bunch grasses. Those were also overlaid with extensive seedings of sagebrush or forbs or aerial seedings of grasses. These treatment effects I won't really talk much about today. Just know that there's a myriad set of combinations here. Now for grazing, unfortunately, grazing is really difficult to study in these landscapes. And the reason is that you can't just look at how many AUMs or how many cows were allowed at different times into each of the 105 pastures that are in these landscapes. And the problem is that you don't know where in those large pastures the cows actually went. We know from our studies that those cows are closer to water and on flatter landscapes, but even within that, we can't really explain too well where they are. And so because of that, the BLM really motivated the use of these experiments. So experimental exposures were set up in these 5 different areas. And first, I just want to tell you what we learned from the broader landscape away from those exclosures. So using some 2,000 odd observation plots, we discovered some really important things about the benefits of the multiphasic combination of seeding and herbicides. What we discovered is that you could best understand the effectiveness of these if you considered what happened with the volunteer non-target natives, such as the disturbance-adapted increaser, sandbur bluegrass, very common throughout the sagebrush-steppe. And here on the Soda wildfire, you can see it was one of the most abundant native perennials. It's a short-lived perennial. It's too small to be much of a grazing target. It was very abundant. It began to taper off while when the other deeper-rooted, larger perennials recovered. And what Chad, who's sitting here next to me, discovered is that if you accounted for high sandbur bluegrass cover versus low, that you could explain a lot of the variability in the treatment effects. Here I'm just showing herbicide by itself to get us started. Exotic annual grass cover. Again, we would be happy if the treatments got cheatgrass and other exotic annuals to be less than 20% cover, and we're happy if the perennials become more than 20% cover. And here what you can see is that sandbur bluegrass by itself is in a way like a free natural benefit for our goals under 20%. Where it was scarcer, the herbicide had a very strong effect in reducing cheatgrass annual grasses to the target level. By itself, herbicides did a little bit to increase the perennial bunch grasses, so a little bit of a release. But the real benefits came when you sprayed herbicide, imazapic, in the first year after fire, or the first few months after fire, and then you wait a year and you come in with drill seeding. And here you can see a huge increase, especially where you lacked the sandbirds, huge increase to above the target levels for perennial bunch grasses, and a corresponding very large decrease to well below the threshold for exotic annuals. So score, this is what we want. The opposite sequence of drill and then spray also had some good benefits, not quite as good. And then if you're interested, you can read the paper to see many other treatment combinations, such as letting the site go fallow and stabilize itself, and then waiting a year to begin your treatment interventions. Here's some pictures. So herbicide only, pretty effective, not much there. Layer in the drill seeding, and bingo. Most rangeland managers, and especially fire management officers, would be pretty happy with this kind of an outcome. So Chad and we have discovered that temporally separating the herbicides and seeding, combining them both, but separating them is really key. And if you key in with some of these ecologically important drivers of restoration success, your overall outcomes are going to be much better. How about layering on grazing? So again, we've got these long-standing grazing exposures established after the fire, the soda fire, before the cows came back on. Within them, we did the clipping. Clipping is definitely not grazing. So I don't want you to think that we think that, but it's simply a way to look at how the removal of these young recovering plants might affect their ability to provide resistance and resilience. And here you can see these treatments crossed with drill seeding, again, across this huge area. This is big, large scale. Overall, exotic annual grasses were enhanced where the grazing was resumed 2 years after the fire. So not desirable. None of the clippings overall had a strong effect on exotic annual grasses, but the seedings did. That's going to turn out to be pretty important. How about for those perennials? Well, not too surprising, the seedings strongly promoted the perennials. The grazing, early resumption of grazing, detracted from their success. And one of the clipping treatments also detracted from the vigor of the perennials. Here's a graph of what this looks like. So some effects of continuous fall clipping once early on in the recovery, or grazing, or clipping in the spring. All of these tended to increase exotic annual grasses a little bit, but really it was the recovery of the perennials enhanced by the drill seeding, which overwhelmed the system and was the strongest factor. So that just tells us, grazing, maybe, whatever the simulated grazing may be important, but the real factor here is getting those perennials back on the landscape. This is just a mirror image showing, instead of exotic annual grasses, the perennials. How about that stout site? So stout, I think we had close to 100 clipping plots that were pretty large, about 30 by 30-ish feet, something like that. Here you can see strong drill seedings of either the native seacar, it's snake river wheatgrass, or the introduced highly palatable desired Siberian wheatgrass. So this is a story of Idaho and Russia, and a really interesting one. A creative way of looking at these results is to think about this relationship between exotic annual grasses. Remember, we'd love to be below 20% here cover, and the relationship to perennial bunch grasses. And remember, we'd like to be above 20%. So in this area right here is where we'd love to see our plots. Native bunch grasses ended up there even when they were grazed. I should note that CCAR is not exactly the most palatable thing. Instead, that introduced Siberian, highly palatable. Look at this, we slide down the scale, starting to get that curvilinear negative relationship. And oops, let's see, it's not letting me go back. What we discovered is that the ungrazed ended up in that desired box. So I forgot to mention to you, but maybe you noticed that most of these sites were not overly dominated by annuals. In all cases, we had about as much perennial cover as annuals, although it varied a little bit. We did see very clearly combining herbicides and seeding is in this, even with 50-50 blends, is highly desired. That's an important discovery. More papers coming out to support this from our shop. Best performing sequence was spray, prep the seedbed, and then wait 9 to 12 months and begin your drill seeding. And if you key in and design these treatments in light of species like sandbird bluegrass, and I'm guessing the same thing would hold true for biocrust, you probably will get more efficiency out of your treatments. And then, the grazing resumption, unfortunately, we're still too early in this research to give solid guidance, but note that even after 2 years, in all cases, the grazing detracted from our desire to increase perennials and block annual grass invasions. So that's all I've got. The information is useful for planning these post-fire treatments and evaluating them. And again, we need a lot more work on this grazing resumption question. Thank you.
Okay, second to last speaker is Morgan Roche from our Fort Collins Science Center. Morgan spoke a couple weeks back in this series, and today she's going to be telling us about a synthesis of indaziflam and the outcomes for conservation sagebrush ecosystems. So Morgan, I can see your slides.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. The floor is yours.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Leaf, for introducing me. And so this is a new start project, so I'm just going to give you a brief rundown of what we have planned. And first, I want to make sure I thank our funders, the Bureau of Land Management, and then also all of our partners who've contributed either, time or expertise, all sorts of things towards this project. So invasive annual grasses have been spreading rapidly across sagebrush ecosystems, and then we know that alters fire regimes, threatens sagebrush ecosystems, health and safety of the people who live in these ecosystems. And one of the tools that's really powerful for helping control invasive annual grasses are these herbicides. But many of the available herbicides are, have this fairly short-lived effect and need frequent retreatment in order to produce a desired control. So although this is retreating over and over and over again, having to continue that process is a economically costly strategy. So, if managers were to have an herbicide with a longer term action or better understanding of what conditions make an application consistently successful, that would benefit, managers planning those herbicide treatments. So indaziflam, as Matt has already introduced for me, is a pre-emergent herbicide intended to be applied prior to the target vegetation germination. And it does require moisture for activation, but there's some pretty promising results that it can stay active in the soil for numerous years, which is very exciting. So over the summer, it was approved for use on Bureau of Land Management lands. So that means that there's an increased need for information that managers at BLM, but also at other agencies, to understand where its use is supported by science and where they can expect desirable outcomes. So since its release in 2016 for natural systems, there has been a lot of field trials and research, such as the work that Matt and others have presented today. Those studies have all garnered a fuller understanding of the conditions on which it effectively controls invasive annual grasses. But although there's all these studies published, we don't have any synthetic overall picture of those case studies demonstrating where we expect treatments to be successful and where we maybe do not, especially given the pre-treatment vegetation community. So these are three kind of example, very different simplified vegetation communities so if we were to treat all of these with indaziflam, what might the expected outcomes be? So how much invasive cover or bare ground makes it challenging for a native community to reestablish, even if invasive cover was suppressed? What kind of thresholds are there in terms of the established perennial grass community that are sufficient to promote recovery? And then what are the potential risks too of treating an invaded but a relatively diverse native vegetation community? Are there effects that may not be desirable on that native vegetation? And then we might also expect, there's this other layer, we might also expect that vegetation community and structure to interact with potential weather, either prior or following treatment application, since indaziflam is so sensitive to moisture conditions, as well as the overall climatic conditions that exist across the sagebrush biome. So our question overall is to understand what kinds of pre-treatment vegetation conditions specifically are associated with desirable and undesirable outcomes following treatment with indaziflam. Our approach for this data synthesis is kind of three-parted that we're going to step through as we can. So we'll search first all the peer-reviewed literature, reports, theses for all these studies on indaziflam experiments that include information on pre and post-treatment vegetation. We'll review those studies for first a narrative review and just synthesize that information. And then part of this will also include a descriptive analysis, so things like showing the range of potential outcomes for different data categories or ways in which different studies measure success. And then our real hope is to be able to perform a formal meta-analysis. This is pretty dependent on the data quality and quantity that we will be able to extract from the literature. And from these, we'll collect mean variance sample size for variables such as pre and post-treatment vegetation metrics, time to precipitation, amount of precipitation, that kind of thing, and compare those data points using weighted effect sizes to understand treatment efficacy and outcome given those pre-treatment conditions. So how can managers use our potential outcomes? This information can be used to identify those kind of guide points, as the edges of where pre-treatment vegetation conditions where success is more likely or less likely. And this information can be directly plugged into NEPA documentation, supporting the use of indaziflam in locations and in communities where the overall data show that it's more likely to be successful. And the cool thing about this is that we're hoping to have a variety of samples across the biome. So hopefully we'll be able to draw some broad conclusions from that. You can expect a peer-reviewed manuscript report that we're hoping to get out in the fall to the winter of next year. That will come with a data release with the data that we are able to gather from the literature, which approximate treatment locations, application method, and the summary weather data. And then also we're hoping to create a science communication document that kind of synthesizes those results in a more easily digestible manner. And please visit our project webpage. All those information will be eventually put on that webpage, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Right. Our last speaker of the day is Lea Condon from our Western Ecological Research Center. And today Lee's going to be talking to us about the ruderal components of biocrust and can they be maintained under increases in drought and grazing and feral horses. So Lee, I can see your slides.
Great. Thanks, Leaf. I take it you can hear me too. Okay.
Your face, floor is yours.
Great. Yeah, I'm really happy to be able to wrap us up today with some expertise on biocrust. And I want to acknowledge our collaborators on this project. And in particular, Diana Tataru, who had been with us doing a postdoc and really took some of the analysis on this project forward. And some acknowledgements as well. Special thanks to funders at the Bureau of Land Management, the Wildlife Program, and a lot of people that we work with regularly. And there's some other accomplishments with this project that I want to highlight. One being that we've fledged several biocrust technicians. So we've got more biocrust expertise in the region. And about half of these folks have now started or will start graduate school soon, which is pretty exciting. And one is even locally doing graduate school. And we've now got a pretty extensive data set of biocrust data across Nevada now too, which is very exciting. But why biocrust? There's a number of reasons why we want to focus it on biocrust. And one is that there are no negative relationships between invasive annual grasses and biocrust. And as I'm sure most folks listening know, that these are the grasses that are responsible for changing the fire regime in our region. So leading to more extensive fires, more frequent fires. Biocrusts are also really important for maintaining higher soil moisture, that you tend to find higher soil moisture under biocrust, which is really important in arid lands and when we're thinking about maintaining plant cover. And those folks that study biocrust know that they're really important in soil stabilization. And so, you know, given the title of this talk, we know that there's a number of threats that are coming at us when it comes to things that might influence biocrust cover. And so those that we've decided to tackle here are drought, grazing, and feral horses. And so objectives with the study were that we'd identify anticipated changes in composition of biocrust given climatic conditions, identify timing of grazing that is associated with maintaining some components of biocrust, and identify areas most likely to be affected by feral horses. And this sort of highlights those objectives again and how we plan on tackling each one. But for the most part, I'm just going to focus on this first one today of climatic conditions and using climate and soil moisture metrics to get at changes in biocrust composition. And just highlighting again our very exciting data set that we now have of 171 sites across Nevada, and that we were able to account for feral horses and seasons of grazing. And we've leveraged this project with ground truthing of what we're calling our easy guide to biocrust morphogroups. And the idea with that project is really that we can put a tool into the hands of people that are interested in biocrust so that they can start to recognize them in the field. And we've already worked with a lot of managers across the region on this already. But if this is something that's of interest to you and we haven't connected yet, please do reach out. And on the last slide, I do show my email address to help facilitate that. And, you know, this project is one that's building on a body of work that's building and building all the time, right? And so we've already got 2 publications out that start to look at climatic conditions and biocrust. One was some moss restoration that I had done with Dave Pike. And we see that overwintering is really important for growing mosses. And then more work with Dave Pike, but looking at the AIM data set and climatic drivers and seeing how aridity, and as aridity is represented by maximum vapor pressure deficit, is really important in predicting lichen cover. But here, we were able to use a lot of the soil moisture metrics that John Bradford and Daniel Schlafer have developed. And when thinking about light algal crust, some things came out very strongly. And one I was relieved to see was the cover of bare ground we found to be very associated with cover of light algal crust. And this is something I've been noting and sharing for some time, but it was nice to be able to show it with our data as well. And then thinking of soil moisture drivers, what really came out for cover of light algal crust were wet degree days in the spring recruitment period. So when you've got soil moisture in spring, this was really influential in how much light algal crust we saw in the field. And a goal that we had with this project, oops, did we not go back? Good, I went back. A goal that we had with this project was being able to put maps into the hands of managers so that you might have a sense of where you're likely to see some of these ruderal components on the landscape, just spatially, right? And so we're still working on the right layers to use to predict some of this. And so very preliminary here, but we've used what's readily available and some of the PRISM data to do this, just to provide a map for now. But what we are seeing is that light algal crust really can be across the state of Nevada. We're feeling like we're likely to see higher cover under some conditions and areas. And here, this map, I think, is really highlighting, mountain ranges and probably picking up on the fact that you can have more soil moisture there. And so that's why the map is predicting higher cover there. But for the most part, to think that we're ranging between 15 and 16.5% cover just with these predictors alone, I think is pretty exciting and speaks that, you really can find light algal crust across Nevada. Thinking about short mosses, what jumped out here were wet degree days. So again, soil moisture being available, maybe season didn't matter so much. We see spring recruitment wet degree days come out more strongly associated as measured by node purity increase. But when we think about mean square or other variables or ways of assessing this, wet degree days comes out stronger. And so another map here, and similar story to light algal crust, but inverted in some ways, that again, we have the potential to see short mosses across the state of Nevada. But, we're predicting, and these are very low cover ranges, but predicting higher cover more in the lowland areas, less mountainous areas, but still the potential to see short moss across the state of Nevada based on climate metrics. And then jumping into tall mosses, this was interesting too, because it's almost like we've crossed the gamut or covered the gamut with soil moisture variables and what particular biocrust might be picking out. But here we've got just sort of a group of variables that come out, and several of those have to do with the fall season. So soil moisture during the fall season, beginning of the fall season, seems really important for tall mosses. And other things that came out were influences of solar radiation, which other folks have found in other studies as well in other regions. So that was good to see. And then another predictive map here. Again, we're talking low cover values, but again, we're seeing the potential for tall moss across the state of Nevada. And so I don't have as much time to jump into these other objectives, and they're still very much works in progress, that we're looking at different seasons of grazing and decided to split them up based on dry season only. So those seasons where grazing happened that was in the summer or the fall, or summer and fall, that being our dry season, versus wet season being winter only, spring only, or the combination of winter and spring. And then intermediate being anything that crossed those two. And what comes out here is not a difference in season of grazing so much, but differences in cover of morpho groups. But what has yet to be included in this analysis is incorporating soil texture. And we already know that that's very important, that We need to have a firm substrate under biocrust when grazing happens, if they're to be maintained. And that's already shown in Condon et al. 2024 in Geoderma. And then our last objective, just touching on this slightly too, and more work to be done here, but was looking at feral horses. And we see ranges of cover where feral horses have been noted and mapped as well. And some trends to highlight here, that focusing in on light algal crust, we tended to see higher cover where horses weren't noted. And it doesn't mean that horses weren't there, but they're not mapped areas of horses, such as herd areas or herd management areas. And if we group everything together, all of our ruderal crust, and then just try to assess if there's a difference in cover with and without horses, p-value sort of on the line there, but in a weak model. But this is only accounting for horses, not our other climatic variables or soil variables yet. So works in progress. But if there's some thoughts I can leave you with, that's that given climatic conditions, ruderal biocrusts have the potential to be across the state of Nevada, and that season of moisture appears to select for different groups of biocrust. So I'll wrap up there, and here's my email address if you're interested in talking biocrust or you have questions that you don't have a chance to get to today. Thanks.
I think that's all the science we have for today, Jeannie.
Great. Thank you for the great presentations, and thank you for all the good questions, attendees. We would greatly appreciate it if you would take our 4-question survey that will appear after I close the webinar or when you close out. Thanks for all the feedback from last week, much appreciated.